Few American cities have been asked to carry as much of the nation's founding mythology as Philadelphia, and few have done so with such complicated results. It sits at the confluence of two rivers, the Delaware and the Schuylkill, on the mid-Atlantic coast of Pennsylvania, a city that was born before the country was, that housed the government of the Revolution, that drafted both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution within blocks of each other in the same summer heat, and that was then quietly passed over as the permanent capital in a political deal struck between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton over a dinner table in New York. Philadelphia has spent the 2 centuries since that dinner processing what it means to be the place where the American idea was articulated and then moved on from. The city that called itself the Cradle of Liberty has also been, in the same streets and often in the same decades, a city of slavery, of racial violence, of a municipal government that once dropped a bomb on its own neighborhood. It has been the workshop of the world, and then one of the poorest large cities in the United States. To understand Philadelphia is to understand that the American story has never been simple, and that the place most responsible for its founding language has always been living inside its contradictions. This is the story of Philadelphia. Before William Penn's ship arrived, before the grid of streets was surveyed, before anyone put a name on the peninsula between the two rivers, the land had been home for thousands of years to the Lenape people, whom the English would call the Delaware. They were Algonquian-speaking people who had occupied the Delaware River Valley and its surrounding woodlands since long before European contact, living in semi-permanent villages along the riverbanks, farming maize and beans and hunting the forests and fishing the abundant coastal waters. Their society was organized around clans defined through the maternal line, their governance structured through councils, their relationship to the land organized around the understanding that it was held in common and could not be owned in the absolute way that European law defined ownership. When the Dutch and then the Swedes arrived in the Delaware Valley in the first half of the 17th century, the Lenape experienced what indigenous peoples across the Americas had already experienced: the introduction of European trade goods, the introduction of European diseases against which they had no immunity, and the gradual encroachment on their territory that trade relationships tended to produce. By the time William Penn arrived in 1682, the Lenape had already lost thousands of people to smallpox and other epidemics. Penn's approach to the indigenous population was, by the standards of colonial America, relatively respectful. He purchased land from the Lenape before settling it, negotiated treaties that he intended to honor, and met with Lenape leaders under an elm tree at Shackamaxon on the Delaware shore, in a ceremony that passed into Pennsylvania legend. But the goodwill Penn established did not survive him. His sons, who inherited the proprietorship after Penn's death in 1718, orchestrated the infamous walking purchase of 1737, which defrauded the Lenape of approximately 1,200 square miles through a straightforward fraud, a supposed deed promising as much land as a man could walk. In a day and a half was executed by hiring the fastest runners in the colony, who had already cleared paths through the forest and who covered nearly 70 miles before the time expired. The betrayal poisoned relations permanently. The people who had negotiated in good faith with the founder of Pennsylvania lost their homeland through a race. Penn himself arrived in October 1682 aboard the ship Welcome, a man whose biography contained more adventure and contradiction than most historical figures could sustain. Born in London in 1644, the son of a British admiral who was owed a substantial debt by King Charles II, Penn had converted to Quakerism in his early 20s and had been imprisoned in the Tower of London for his refusal to recant his beliefs. When the king offered to settle his father's debt with a land grant in the New World, Penn saw an opportunity to create what he called a holy experiment, a colony built on the Quaker principles of religious tolerance, equality before the law, and peaceful resolution of disputes, principles that were genuinely radical in 17th century Europe, where religious persecution was the norm and dissenters were routinely executed or imprisoned. He named his capital city Philadelphia from the Greek words for brotherly love, and he laid it out on a rational grid between the Delaware and Schuylkill rivers, wide streets running east to west, crossed by narrower ones running north to south, organized around a central square and four smaller ones, at the corners of the plain, with room for gardens between the houses so that the city could never be consumed by the fires that periodically destroyed the wooden cities of colonial America. Penn's grid was one of the most influential acts of urban planning in American history, copied by town planners from Georgia to Illinois. The city that grew inside it was, from the beginning, genuinely diverse. Quakers, German Mennonites and Lutherans, Welsh Baptists, Scots-Irish Presbyterians, Sephardic Jews, and Swedish and Finnish settlers who had been in the region before Penn arrived all coexisted in Philadelphia in ways that were unusual for the era. By 1700, the colony had nearly 20,000 residents. By the time of the American Revolution, Philadelphia was the largest city in the British colonies and the second largest English-speaking city in the world after London. What made Philadelphia great in the colonial era was not just its tolerance, but its curiosity. Benjamin Franklin arrived in 1723 as a 17-year-old runaway printer's apprentice from Boston. And over the following 6 decades, he became the city's defining figure, a man whose restlessness of mind encompassed electricity, diplomacy, satire, civic institution building, and the management of his own public image with equal facility. Franklin founded the first public library in America in Philadelphia in 1731, the first volunteer fire company in 1736, and the institution that became the University of Pennsylvania in 1740. He established the American Philosophical Society, the first learned society in the colonies, and proved that lightning was electrical in a thunderstorm on the outskirts of the city in 1752. When he was not inventing bifocals or the lightning rod or the flexible urinary catheter, he was writing, printing, and distributing the ideas that would eventually coalesce into the American Republic. The city Franklin had helped build was, by the 1770s, the natural gathering place for the colonial resistance to British taxation and authority. The first Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia's Carpenter's Hall in September 1774. The Second Continental Congress returned to the Pennsylvania State House in May 1775, a month after the first shots of the Revolution had been fired at Lexington and Concord. It was in that building, in the summer of 1776, that the delegates debated and approved the Declaration of Independence, a document drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson in a rented room on Market Street, revised by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, and adopted by 12 of the 13 colonial delegations on July 4, 1776, with New York abstaining. The bell in the State House tower was rung to summon the citizens of Philadelphia to hear the Declaration read aloud for the first time. It has been called the Liberty Bell ever since. The British Army captured Philadelphia in September 1777, forcing the Continental Congress to flee and conduct its business from a series of temporary locations while Washington's army endured the winter at Valley Forge, 20 miles to the northwest. The British held the city for 9 months, quartering troops in the finest houses and turning Christ Church into a military hospital, before abandoning it in June 1778. The Congress returned, the city rebuilt, and in 1787, Philadelphia hosted the Constitutional Convention, in which 55 delegates from 12 states gathered in the same Pennsylvania State House, where the Declaration had been signed 11 years before, and spent 4 months debating and drafting the document that would govern the United States for the following 2 centuries and beyond. The Constitution they produced in Philadelphia has been called the world's oldest written national constitution still in use. The room where it was signed, now called Independence Hall, still stands on Chestnut Street. The capital of the new republic settled in Philadelphia from 1790 to 1800, while the permanent capital on the Potomac was being constructed. The city was at the peak of its national prominence, the largest in the country, the center of American commerce and finance and intellectual life, the place where the federal government operated and where the great figures of the founding era, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Hamilton, gathered for the business of making a nation. Into this moment of civic confidence, in the summer of 1793, came a catastrophe that neither the city's institutions nor its ideology had prepared it for. The first cases of yellow fever appeared in the waterfront neighborhoods along the Delaware in early August. By September, it was killing 100 people a day. The disease, spread by the bites of infected mosquitoes, a fact that would not be understood for another century, progressed rapidly from fever and chills to jaundice, hemorrhage, and black vomit as the liver and kidneys failed. Of Philadelphia's 50,000 residents, roughly 5,000 died between August and November of 1793, when a killing frost finally destroyed the mosquito population. 20,000 people, including President Washington, most of the federal cabinet, and the bulk of the city's wealthy population, fled to the countryside, leaving the poor behind. The city government collapsed under the strain. The free black community of Philadelphia, which had been falsely assured by the prominent physician Benjamin Rush that African Americans were immune to the disease, stayed and served, nursing the sick, collecting the dead, burying them, and then died of the fever themselves in numbers Rush had not predicted and later refused to acknowledge. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, leaders of the black community, organized the response themselves and documented the work their people had done, and the false accusations of profiteering that were made against them afterward, in a pamphlet that became one of the earliest works of African American political writing in the country's history. The capital moved to Washington in 1800, and Philadelphia's role in the national story shifted, though the city itself did not diminish. The political center had migrated south, but the economic and intellectual center remained on the Delaware. What followed in the 19th century was an industrial expansion of astonishing scope. Philadelphia became what contemporaries called the workshop of the world, a manufacturing city of extraordinary diversity and depth, producing textiles, locomotives, ships, machine tools, carpets, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, and processed food in a system of thousands of small and medium-sized firms clustered by industry in different neighborhoods. By the late 19th century, the city had become the center of the American locomotive industry, its Baldwin Locomotive Works, the largest in the world. The cramped shipyards on the Delaware launched warships and ocean liners. Textile mills in Kensington and Manayunk ran around the clock. In 1920, at the peak of Philadelphia's industrial employment, 359,000 residents worked in manufacturing, 45% of the city's entire labor force. The immigrants who fueled this industry came from every corner of Europe. The Irish had been arriving since the famine years of the 1840s, the Germans and Scandinavians throughout the second half of the 19th century, and from the 1880s onward came Italians, Poles, Russian Jews, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians, each group settling in distinct neighborhoods that maintained their languages and traditions and mutual aid societies. South Philadelphia became Italian. Kensington became Irish, and then Eastern European. Northern Liberties housed Germans. The Jewish neighborhoods moved progressively through South Philadelphia and then northward. The city absorbed all of them, unevenly and sometimes violently, as American cities did. But the economy was large enough and varied enough to provide employment to successive waves of newcomers who were willing to work for whatever the market would bear. What the workshops and the industrial economy did not freely offer to Philadelphia's black population. That population had been building for itself since before the Revolution. The black community of Philadelphia was, by the late 18th century, one of the largest and most organized free black communities in North America, shaped by the Quaker influence that had produced some of the earliest and most sustained anti-slavery activism on the continent. At the center of this community stood Richard Allen, a man born into slavery in Philadelphia in 1760, sold with his family to a Delaware farmer, converted to Methodism as a teenager, and allowed to purchase his freedom by working additional jobs for 5 years. He returned to Philadelphia and began preaching at St. George's Methodist Church, where his 5 o'clock morning sermons drew crowds of black Philadelphians so large that the white congregation grew uncomfortable and began enforcing racial segregation within the building. In response, Allen and his fellow activist, Absalom Jones, led the black congregants out of St. George's in 1787 and founded the Free African Society, a mutual aid organization that became the nucleus of black civic life in the city. In 1794, Allen opened Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church at 6th and Lombard Streets. In 1816, he united the AME congregations of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland into the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first fully independent black denomination in the United States, and was elected its first bishop. The land under Mother Bethel at 6th and Lombard is the oldest parcel of real estate in the United States in continuous African American ownership. From 1797 until his death in 1831, Allen and his wife Sarah operated a station on the Underground Railroad, sheltering freedom seekers heading north. The church he built has never closed. The Great Migration brought a new wave of black Philadelphians north from the South, from Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and beyond, in the decades surrounding both world wars, transforming neighborhoods like North Philadelphia and West Philadelphia, and creating a cultural and civic infrastructure that was, like Bronzeville in Chicago or Harlem in New York, the result of confinement transformed into community. By the mid-20th century, North Philadelphia was a dense, vibrant black neighborhood with its own churches, newspapers, political clubs, and nightlife. The Uptown Theater on Broad Street was one of the great stops on the African American entertainment circuit, its stage graced by the same performers who filled the Apollo in New York. The community was segregated, excluded from most of the city's economic and civic life, and building everything it had entirely from within. Out of that community in the early 1970s came one of the most distinctive sounds in the history of American popular music. Kenny Gamble, a lyricist and storyteller from South Philadelphia, and Leon Huff, a classically inclined pianist from Camden, New Jersey, across the Delaware, had been working together since the mid-1960s as session musicians and independent producers. In 1971, they founded Philadelphia International Records, a black-owned label backed by Columbia Records, and set up operations at Sigma Sound Studios on North 12th Street. What they produced there, with producer and arranger Tom Bell and a core ensemble of roughly 30 studio musicians, known collectively as MFSB, was soul music in a tuxedo, as Sigma's founder Joe Tarsia once described it. Lush orchestral arrangements over driving rhythmic pulse, politically conscious lyrics balanced against melodies so immediately accessible that the songs felt like necessities rather than entertainments. Philadelphia International in the 1970s released hit after hit that crossed every demographic boundary the American music industry had constructed. The OJ's Love Train and Backstabbers, Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes' If You Don't Know Me By Now, Billy Paul's Me and Mrs. Jones, Teddy Pendergrass's devastating tenor, the Jacksons' recordings before they went to Epic. All of it came from the same building on North 12th Street, the same 30 musicians, the same two men who sat at a piano in Gamble's office and talked about what was happening in the city and the country before they started writing. When Don Cornelius needed a new theme song for Soul Train in 1973, he came to Philadelphia. MFSB recorded TSOP, The Sound of Philadelphia, and it became one of the most recognized instrumental pieces in American pop history. The lush orchestrations, the four-on-the-floor rhythmic drive, and the sophisticated string arrangements that Gamble and Huff had been developing were the direct antecedents of what the rest of the decade would call disco. Philadelphia had given the world another thing it did not fully credit to its source. On May 13th, 1985, the city of Philadelphia did something that no American city had done before and has not done since. The Philadelphia Police Department, pursuing members of a black liberation and back to nature commune called MOVE, who had been in escalating conflict with the city for years, used a police helicopter to drop a military-grade satchel bomb composed of Tovex and C4 explosives onto the rooftop bunker of MOVE's row house at 6221 Osage Avenue in the Cobbs Creek neighborhood of West Philadelphia. The bomb ignited a fire. The fire department, under orders from city officials, stood down rather than immediately fighting the blaze. By the time firefighters were directed to act, more than 60 row homes were burning. 11 people inside the MOVE house died. 6 adults and 5 children, the youngest of them 7 years old. 2 city blocks of working-class black homeowners' houses were destroyed. 250 people were left homeless. The commission appointed by the city to investigate found the decision to drop the bomb unconscionable and described the decision to let the fire burn as a catastrophic failure of judgment. A federal jury found the city liable in 1996. The mayor who had authorized the bombing was Wilson Goode, Philadelphia's first black mayor. The neighborhood that was destroyed was a black middle-class neighborhood. The people who died were members of a community that Philadelphia's institutions had never served well and were now actively destroying. The city's response in the years after: the botched rebuilding of the Osage Avenue houses, the mismanagement of the displaced residents' settlement funds, the decades of incomplete accountability, extended the disaster long beyond the day of the bombing. May 13, 1985, sits in Philadelphia's history not as an aberration, but as a concentrated expression of the failure of a city to protect the people least protected within it. Philadelphia City Council issued a formal apology in 2020, 35 years after the fire went out. The deindustrialization that had been underway since the 1920s accelerated through the post-war decades with a ferocity that reshaped the city entirely. The textile mills of Kensington closed or moved south or offshore. The Baldwin Locomotive Works, which had been the world's largest locomotive manufacturer, shut down in 1956. The cramped shipyards were gone. Between 1950 and 2000, Philadelphia lost more than 300,000 manufacturing jobs. The population, which had peaked at just over 2 million in 1950, fell to 1.4 million by 2010, as residents followed the jobs to the suburbs or to the Sunbelt cities that were growing where Philadelphia was shrinking. The neighborhoods that were left behind, North Philadelphia, Kensington, West Philadelphia, experienced the cascading consequences of disinvestment: underfunded schools, deteriorating housing, concentrated poverty, and the social crises that follow when an economy withdraws from a community faster than a community can adapt. By the early 2000s, Philadelphia had the highest poverty rate of any large city in the United States, a distinction it has never entirely shed. The revival that began taking shape in the 2000s and 2010s was real and partial in equal measure. Center City and the neighborhoods immediately surrounding it, Fishtown, Northern Liberties, Fairmount, Point Breeze, attracted investment, restaurants, young professionals, and rising property values. The Mural Arts Program, founded in 1984 and now the largest public art program in the United States, had covered more than 4,000 walls across the city, with murals that narrated its history, its communities, and its aspirations, turning entire neighborhoods into open-air galleries. The Barnes Foundation moved its extraordinary collection of Renoirs and Cézanne and Matisse from the suburbs to a purpose-built building on the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. The university system, Penn, Temple, Drexel, Jefferson, and a dozen others, became the city's most stable economic engine, employing more Philadelphians than any single manufacturing sector ever had. But the revival left much of the city behind it. The neighborhoods where manufacturing had once employed generations of working-class families remained among the most impoverished in the country. Kensington, which had been the center of the American textile industry, became the center of the American opioid crisis. Its sidewalks and vacant lots, lined with the visible evidence of an epidemic that neither the city's famous founding documents, nor its music nor its murals could address on their own. Philadelphia is a city that has been defined, from the beginning, by the distance between its stated ideals and its lived realities. William Penn wrote about brotherly love, and his sons defrauded the people who had negotiated with him in good faith. The Continental Congress declared all men created equal and left intact the institution of slavery that contradicted that declaration in every particular. Richard Allen built a church on ground that is still Black-owned and operational after more than 2 centuries, while the city around it confined his community to a geography from which they were never supposed to escape. Gamble and Huff made music in a tuxedo that the whole country danced to, in a city that spent decades failing to invest in the neighborhoods where that music came from. The government of Philadelphia dropped a bomb on its own people, and then mismanaged the reparations. And yet, the Liberty Bell still hangs in its pavilion on Market Street, cracked in a way that makes it imperfect and therefore true. Independence Hall still stands on Chestnut Street, its brick facade unchanged from the summer of 1776 and the summer of 1787. Mother Bethel is still at 6th and Lombard, still the oldest continuously African-American-owned land in the country. The murals are still going up on the walls of neighborhoods that have been told by every economic indicator that they do not matter. Philadelphia has never been able to live up to its name, and it has never stopped trying. That gap between what a city calls itself and what it actually is, that space where the work is where Philadelphia has always lived, and where it lives still.